No booming cannons or musket fire awakened troops near Fort Kearny the morning of April 12, 1861. But later in the day, they do hear a different kind of sound signaling war.
The telegraph at the time actually reached out here to Fort Kearny, and they found out about the firing of Fort Sumter on April 12th, on the exact same day.
Michael Sovin is with the Great Platte River Road Archway in Kearny.
The news hit Nebraska quick, and changes started happening almost immediately.
In April 1861, Nebraska is still a territory. It's a slavery-free region, and anti-secession feelings run strong. James Potter is the senior research historian for the Nebraska State Historical Society.
The U.S. Army at the time was a very small force, and the minute the war began, they immediately started calling back all of these regular troops to the east, withdrawing them from places like Fort Kearny, Fort Laramie, which at that time was part of Nebraska territory.
The real concern for Nebraskans isn't the war as much as it is the threat from Indian attack. Again, Michael Sovin.
And so without there being soldiers in the forts, a lot of the merchants, they've now lost their business. They don't have protection for shipping their freights.
The Civil War has little direct effect on Nebraska. There are no battles or skirmishes fought within territorial borders. No Confederate troops attempt to invade. William Thomas, chair of the Department of History at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, says most Nebraskans want to keep the Union together.
Their motivation, like thousands and thousands of Northern troops who signed up in that first month, was to save the Union.
Nebraska attitudes are influenced by something that happened before the war. Passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Its purpose is to generate opportunities for a transcontinental railroad. But in pre-war America, the real impact is to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820.
So the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed for popular sovereignty on the issue of slavery. But nobody was really clear what that meant. And in fact, that's why there was such a bloody confrontation in Kansas over whether slavery would be allowed or not.
In June 1861, the federal government requests the Nebraska Territory form one volunteer regiment, with some companies to stay behind to protect the territory against feared Indian uprisings. The 1st Regiment Nebraska Volunteer Infantry is formed, but by August sent eastward to fight the Confederacy, serving under then-General Ulysses S. Grant. Tom King is a professor of education at Doane College in Crete. He also portrays General Grant through Chautauquan presentations. Chautauqua is an adult education movement in the U.S. which promotes community entertainment and culture. Here he talks, as General Grant, about the Nebraska Infantry.
Initially, the Nebraskans volunteered because they thought they were going to be defending the western forts like at Fort Kearny. What happened was the war was going so poorly in the east that it became quite evident that the Union Army needed the Nebraskans to help fight in some major efforts that were going on eventually into Fort Donelson and Fort Henry in 1862.
The impact of the Civil War on Nebraska doesn't come on the battlefield as much as it does from the South vacant Congress. In 1862, 3 pieces of legislation pass: the Homestead Act, Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act, and the Pacific Railways Act. Together, they paved the way for settlement of Nebraska during and after the war. Again, Will Thomas of UNL.
White Southern leaders saw the Pacific Railroad issue and the Homestead issue in a similar light. Most people who came to Nebraska were interested in land and settlement. They were not by conviction necessarily abolitionist, but they were largely anti-slavery.
"150 years later, it's hard to grasp the enormity of the Civil War. It was America's 4 bloodiest years, when brother fought brother and entire families were lost. And maybe it's simplistic to talk about the Civil War in the number of lives lost, but that is, unfortunately, one way to put the conflict into perspective. 239 Nebraskans were either killed or died as a direct result of the Civil War. That's about the current population of Garland, Nebraska in Seward County, or Bruning in Thayer County. And the total of lives lost nationwide, 625,000. That's almost exactly the same total number of people living today in Omaha and Lincoln combined. The U.S. lost more lives during the Civil War than in all other U.S. fought wars combined to date. For NET News, I'm Jonathan Ash.